Well, this morning we are still in our sermon series based on discernment. How do we decide God's will for our lives? And importantly for the church in this time, how do we discern God's will for the church? And we want to say together our kind of scripture verse for the, our theme scripture verse for the sermon series, Proverbs 3, 5 through 6. Would you say that with me, please? Trust in the
Lord with all your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths.
We began this worship today with a little segment from Fiddler on the Roof. And Tevye is in struggles, deep struggles, to decide which way to go. He is on the other hand, and on the other hand, as he is making a decision about his daughter and their tradition. It's one of my favorite musicals, and I love to sing all the songs from it. And tradition is the theme for our sermon series today with discerning God's will for us. The first thing we listed in our interview with the 105-year-old Ms. Silverbrook was tradition. She's been around for 105 years, and that creates a lot of tradition, and that's one of the gifts she has that has helped her live this long. And anytime we list our gifts or why we like Silverbrook, tradition is another one of those that comes up in the top 5. A first-time visitor last week loved our service because it was like going back 100 years. So tradition is a part of who we are, and part of that tradition are the saints. The saints who have gone before us, and we live in their legacy. We are grateful for the faith they have continued and taught and passed down, just like we heard in Hebrews, so that we can continue to know the faith and live the faith as they did. Tradition is very important in the church. It tells us a lot about who we are and whose we are and who we are becoming. Saints are those who have helped us build up and maintain and even change our tradition when it's necessary. Part of our United Methodist tradition is John Wesley, and he had 4 things which he based his discernment processes on: scripture, reason, tradition, and experience. These were the tools he used to discern God's will for us. Wesley never specifically outlined those 4 things, we call them the quadrilateral, as a way to know God's will, but if you read all of his work, like the scholar Aldo Outler did, you can see that pattern in Wesley's discerning God's will for his life and for the future of the Methodist Church he ultimately created. Scripture always comes first, and Scripture is a part of the other 3. But tradition, reason, and experience are things that we need to look at when we are discerning God's will for our lives, where we're going to go in God's path. Because we've talked about Scripture before, and Scripture is always up there. So it's very important. In our sermon series on discernment, we've spoken of the importance of Scripture, and we'll continually talk about the Scriptures throughout this series to help us figure out how to know God's will for us, for our own lives, and for Silverbrook. But Wesley loved the traditions of the Anglican Church, and he studied how many other churches worked and worshipped, and he blended the good from other churches to create his life and his devotional time and his books and worship and the church. Tradition was revered, but it was not the be-all and end-all of everything. Because although the Scriptures put a lot of stock in tradition, they do not hold it as the be-all and end-all of everything. Let's face it, if we had to keep the past holy, we would still be slaves in Egypt. So we balance tradition as we remember the God of creation, who is always making all things new. We stand like Tevye. On the other hand, we try to discern God's will, which way to go. A United Methodist website defines Wesley's interpretation of tradition as tradition is experience and the witness and development of growth of the faith through the past centuries and in many nations and cultures. But it means even more than that. When Wesley speaks of tradition, he does not merely refer to ancient church tradition and the writings of the great theologians of church history, the mothers and the fathers of days past, and he's also talking about our immediate and present theological influences which contribute to a person's understanding of God and of Christian theology. Tradition may include such influences as our beliefs, our values and instruction in one's family, and our upbringing. It may also include the various beliefs and values which one encounters and which have an effect on one's understanding of Scripture. So all of those things mean tradition. It's just not the 2,000 years of church history. And so tradition is to inform us as it forms us into the future. Sometimes tradition was the way to go. Sometimes traditions have to be let go in order for the church to grow. This is the way Jesus did it. If we look at Jesus' life, he lifted up and celebrated the Passover meal with his disciples for many years as they traveled together. They celebrated that meal. It's a meal that was celebrated from the time that they left Egypt, and Moses and God rescued the people of Egypt. From that time until Jesus' time, they had celebrated the sacred Passover meal. That meal reminded Jesus and the disciples of their ancestors who spent time as slaves in Egypt, and it reminded them of the caring and loving God who called Moses to go to Egypt and rescue them from slavery. And that Passover meal was so important, it was one of the last things he did with his disciples before going to the cross. And in that moment, or actually maybe on Easter moment, that meal was changed into our communion meal that we'll celebrate later today. So the tradition was important. And then when Jesus came, he renewed it and made it different, and it's still important for us today. And Jesus continues to want to free us from slavery, for it is an act of healing. Healing is an important part of all our scriptures and tradition, and that which brings healing must be lifted up, and it may mean we change the way we do things, or do church, or traditions, in order to bring and lift up healing and wholeness. And there's lots of other themes as we go through the scriptures. I'm just lifting up a couple of them for you. Sometimes Jesus challenged the Pharisees and brought back a tradition or reclaimed it in a way God meant it to be celebrated. Many people of Jesus' day had corrupted the Sabbath with lots of rules of do's and don'ts. And Jesus reclaimed the joy and love and celebration of the Sabbath by saying Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So he reclaimed the joy and celebration and the honoring of God that was to take place. He told his disciples it was okay to gather grain on that day and to eat it on the Sabbath day. That was something that was forbidden by all the do's and don'ts that were made by the church. But Jesus freed them from that. For Sabbath was meant to be healing and joyful, not punishing and dull. The early church revered tradition and followed it as much as they could. Scholars look at the hymns and liturgy and scriptures of this time period and see much that heralds back to our Jewish roots. But things also changed after Jesus was risen from the dead, and so other traditions had to change. The early church had a huge juggling game, trying to decide what traditions were to be kept. Do we keep circumcision? Do we jettison circumcision? Without Jesus, there was no direct guide, and it was difficult to decide, and they had a lot of discerning to do in that early church. And God guided them when changes needed to be made. One of the most extreme changes was a vision that was given to Peter. It's found in the book of Acts chapter 10, and it's really a long story, but I'm just going to read the story of the vision. So if you want to read the story, it's very interesting how this tradition changed. But here's the vision that Peter received that told him to change something long held in our tradition. Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat, and while it was being prepared, he fell into a trance. And he saw the heaven opened, and something like a large sheet coming down, being lowered to the ground by its four corners. And in it were all kinds of four-footed creatures, and reptiles, and birds of the air. And then he heard a voice saying, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." And Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean." And the voice said to him again a second time, "What God has made clean, you must not call profane." This happened 3 times, and the thing was suddenly taken up into heaven. And at that point, Peter knew that he could go and eat and be with the Gentiles who did not keep kosher food practices, because all the things in the sheet were unkosher animals that they were not allowed to eat. And so God had to give this vision to Peter so that they could change something that was excluding people from the church, because Gentiles couldn't be a part if they couldn't keep kosher food. And so that tradition had to be let go. because it was hurting the growth and inclusion of the church. So we acquaint saints with the idea of tradition, but if you read the lives of the saints over the last 2,000 years of church history, you will find that they often bucked or encouraged the expansion or altering of tradition to fit the needs of the new generation of church. In another devotional by Father Richard Rohr, he comments on All Saints' Day, or the Feast of Holiness. It's technically November 1st. All Hallows Eve is October 31st, and then All Saints' Day is November 1st. And we always celebrate it on the first Sunday in November, is All Saints' Day. And his reflection for All Saints' Day was, actually, this is a Christian meaning of reincarnation, which Christians also call the communion of saints in the Apostles' Creed. This is the common and corporate notion of the human person. It realized that our ancestors are indeed in us and with us, as modern DNA studies now prove. And then early Christianity added maybe even for all of us. All Saints' Day is a celebration of all of us, precisely in our togetherness, which is why the New Testament in 20 places called all God lovers the saints. In other words, you are a saint because you love God, and as a saint, it's your job to pass on the tradition, to share the love of God with all, and to come here and continue the tradition of worshiping together. Today, John Wilson, our historian, illuminated some of Silverbrook's saints and our history as a celebration of our tradition. And as we are trying to figure out who we've been, we will see our gifts and graces, and we'll see our major characteristics, and then we'll see how we can honor and carry on those that are needed and lay to rest those that we don't need anymore. As I read through our history this week, I was struck by several things. Silverbrook has been a church of builders. Literally, we have had construction workers and electricians and carpenters who have given generously of their time and talents to literally build this church, brick by brick in the steps and cement block by cement block and the additions. As I read the history, they kept mentioning the Sunday school superintendents and the vacation Bible school people, and the treasurers were lifted up as saints and gifted folks who used their gifts for God. So education and a passing on of our tradition to our children is an important part of our history. And careful stewardship of our money was also an important part of our history. I also read about monthly potlucks and revivals and fall and spring fests, healing and prayer services, and all of these things, traditions that we continue today. In the past, we were connected in many ways with the prison. The prison is no longer here. But how might that connection shape or not shape our future? Are we to be a part of the schools that sit on the land that once was the prison, or maybe the workhouse that was also a part of the prison? Or maybe we can tend the prisoner's cemetery, or there's something we can do at the water treatment plant. I don't know, but it's something we can think of as we look back at our past and look at how we're going to live into the future. This is our heritage, it's our tradition. It's the lifting up of the saints who have gone before and how hard they worked to create a little bit of the kingdom of earth right here in Lorton through Silverbrook United Methodist Church. These saints and our history and traditions can be incorporated into our vision for Silverbrook and our role here in Lorton now and into our immediate future. And as we listen to the stories of the saints of Silverbrook, we can see how we can be better disciples. They inform our lives and how they made decisions help us to learn how to make decisions. When we are discerning God's will for our individual lives, our tradition is also important. It will shape us, but it doesn't have to determine who we will be. Just because you come from 10 generations of carpenters does not mean God's will for you is to be a carpenter. So we have to balance the tradition of our families with who we are and what God is calling us to be. It's on the other hand. As Wesley pointed out, tradition is more than just the history, but it is the things we do in our families of origin that may be the things we cling to. The way we celebrate Christmas, or the family vacations we take, or the way we gather for an evening meal together. All of these things are part of our tradition, and they have formed and shaped us, and they may help us and shape us as we look to the future to see what God's will is for us. We can look at our history and say, well, I generally respond this way to a crisis or new tasks, and so that will shape what I do and how I do it now. Your past may have taught you what God is not calling you to do, helping you define the next step. So looking to our long-term family traditions and the lives we have lived may show us the path that God has for us now and into the future.